I worked the night shift at a haunted hospital. What happened will terrify you. What if your job was to protect a place, but in the end, you were the one who needed protecting? Tonight's story isn't just another creepy tale, it's the story of a night shift security guard, a small hospital, and a nightmare that no one could have prepared for. Imagine yourself in the cold, dark hours of the night. The hospital is empty, the silence almost deafening, and you've been given a list of bizarre rules to follow. But as the hours pass, strange things start to happen, things that can't be explained. Screams echo through the halls, shadows move when no one is there, and a figure appears from the darkness, a surgeon with eyes that could pierce your soul. But there's one rule you can't ignore: follow them, or you won't survive the night. It was an ordinary evening, or so I thought. My life, in that moment, seemed to be taking the shape of routine. Another day, another night, another job. I had just turned 16, but my youth felt like a distant memory. I wasn't the type to blend in with the crowd. I was a night owl. My body had a strange relationship with sleep, one that never made sense to anyone, least of all me. While the rest of my classmates fought to stay awake in the classroom, I spent my days fighting off sleep. The night, though, was my time. A time when I was at my sharpest, my most alert. The quiet of the dark hours felt like home. I had worked a few odd jobs during my high school years to pay for small luxuries, but it was the night shifts that suited me. I worked security at a university campus, made the rounds at a 24-hour McDonald's, doing the type of work no one else wanted, just to keep myself busy. But none of those jobs had prepared me for the phone call that came on an otherwise typical evening in late October. My phone rang just after dinner, the cold wind howling outside my bedroom window. It was my boss, Mike, a gruff, no-nonsense guy. Mike had been the one to hire me for the McDonald's gig, and he always had that tone in his voice, like every conversation was a transaction. I assumed it was just another call to remind me about my next shift. But when I picked up the phone, I heard something different in his voice. "Jake," he said, voice gravelly, "I got a special offer for you." It wasn't unusual for Mike to give out strange offers now and then, but this time, his words were slower, as if he was weighing them carefully. "I've got a job at a hospital," he continued, his voice lower than usual. "Night shift, pays 3 times what you're making now. You interested?" I hesitated. A hospital? Security guard at a hospital? It didn't sound too glamorous, but the pay was hard to ignore. 3 times what I was making? That was an opportunity one couldn't afford to turn down. I agreed without much thought. After all, I didn't have much going for me at that point, just an aimless teenager with a messed up sleep cycle. The thought of being alone in a hospital at night with no one around didn't bother me. In fact, it sounded peaceful even if the job itself felt off. Mike gave me the details. "You'll start Thursday night. Make sure you're there by 10 p.m. sharp. It's a small hospital. Pretty quiet, but we've had a few incidents lately. Just stick to the rules and you'll be fine. And Jake, don't let your guard down." The line went dead before I could ask him what he meant by that last part. My thoughts were already drifting to the extra cash, the quiet solitude of the night shift, and the hours of uninterrupted time I'd have to myself. I arrived at the hospital around 8:40 p.m. It wasn't far from my house, about a 30-minute drive, but the roads were unexpectedly busy that evening. As I approached the building, I couldn't help but notice its imposing presence. The architecture was a strange mix of medieval brickwork and Romanesque style. It didn't look like any modern hospital I had seen before. It was small, almost cramped in a way, its 3 floors stacked atop one another, the hallways narrow and constricted. When I stepped out of my car, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and walked to the front door. The large glass entrance seemed strangely quiet, as if no one had entered or exited for hours. I pushed the door open, and the interior was just as strange as the outside. It wasn't the bright, clinical white that most hospitals have. Instead, the walls were a muted gray, the light dim, almost eerie, casting shadows in every corner. I made my way to the receptionist's desk where a middle-aged woman sat, her smile warm but her eyes strangely vacant. "Hello," she greeted me, her voice soft and soothing. "You must be Jake. Michael sent you?" "Yeah, that's me," I replied, feeling oddly out of place. I wasn't sure if it was the hospital or just my nervousness, but something didn't sit right with me. "Good," she said, typing something into her computer. "You're a bit early, but that's fine. Would you like some coffee while you wait?" "Sure," I said, still scanning the room. There was something about this place that felt wrong. Something that gnawed at the edges of my mind but was too elusive to put into words. The woman disappeared for a moment and returned with a steaming cup of black coffee. I took a sip, and to my surprise, it tasted incredible. Rich and dark, like it had been brewed for hours. The coffee did little to ease my nerves, though. I couldn't shake the sense that the entire building was watching me. Just as I was finishing my coffee, another security guard walked in. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, his muscles bulging under his uniform. His eyes scanned me with a look of skepticism. "You're the new guy?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. His voice was deep and rough, carrying the weight of authority. "Yeah, that's me," I answered, standing up and extending my hand. "Jake, nice to meet you." He didn't shake my hand at first, but then he grabbed it with a firm grip. "Follow me," he grumbled, turning on his heel. "Let's get this over with." He led me through the dark hallways, the faint sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. The hospital was more cramped than I had imagined. The air smelled sterile, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something musty, as if the building had been abandoned for years. We reached a small security room with a bank of monitors, all showing different sections of the hospital. "These are the cameras," the guard explained, pointing to the monitors. "You'll be watching them most of the night. There are a few places we need to keep an eye on, but otherwise it's quiet. Just do your rounds. Check on things. Don't let anyone in or out unless it's a real emergency." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. He handed me a sheet of paper. "Here are the rules," he said, his voice lowering, almost as if he was trying to make the situation more serious than it already was. "You need to follow these to the letter. If you don't, well, you'll regret it." I looked at the paper. The rules were odd, to say the least. They didn't make sense, not at first. I skimmed through them quickly. 1. Your shift starts at 10 p.m. Make sure you're inside the security room. 2. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., a woman might knock at the door asking to see her husband. Ignore her. 3. If the ICU lights go off, turn them back on immediately. 4. If you see a little girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her and don't speak. 5. Around 1 a.m., check on the patients in the general ward. 6. If it rains, open the door and let people inside, but make sure they leave by morning. 7. If the cameras go out, hide. Do not leave until morning. I laughed under my breath. This had to be a prank, right? A joke to test my professionalism? But deep down, something told me it wasn't. There was no way Mike would go this far just to mess with me. As the clock struck 10 p.m., I took my place in front of the monitors. The hospital felt like a ghost town. The silence was so thick it could suffocate you. But that's when the first rule hit me. I realized that this wasn't just a job. It was a test. A test that, if failed, could cost me far more than just my job. I could feel my pulse quicken as the tall, imposing security guard handed me the list of rules. His eyes locked on mine, an unsettling weight in his gaze. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who joked around. He stood in the doorway of the security room, his shadow stretching across the floor as if he was waiting for me to make sense of these rules, waiting to see if I was serious enough to survive the night. I unfolded the paper slowly, every movement deliberate. There was something about the way he watched me, the silence between us heavy with anticipation. The clock on the wall ticked down, each second dragging like an eternity. As I read, a cold knot formed in my stomach, a primal instinct telling me that these weren't just rules. They were warnings. They were instructions for survival. The first rule seemed simple enough, a mundane instruction really, but I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Your shift will begin at 10 p.m. Make sure you are inside the security room before then. I nodded, already planning in my mind to be ready. The time was drawing close. Nothing odd yet. But I could feel it, that creeping unease in the back of my mind, the kind that grows in the dark corners of your thoughts, whispering that there's more to this job than just the hours on the clock. I moved on to the second rule. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., a woman may appear at the front door asking to see her husband. Ignore her. Pretend she isn't there. I paused at this one, my brow furrowing. A woman? At this hour? What kind of hospital had rules like this? My gut twisted at the thought. The unsettling quiet of the hospital already felt unnerving. I couldn't imagine a woman showing up at the door in the dead of night, asking for someone who was probably never there. I shook the thought away. I felt the guard's eyes on me, still watching. I looked up briefly, but he didn't break his gaze, his expression unreadable. Keep reading, he said in a low, gravelly voice. You'll understand soon enough. I shifted my attention back to the paper, trying to push the eerie feeling out of my mind, though it only grew worse. I scanned the next rule. The lights in the ICU must remain on at all times. If they turn off, you must go to the ICU and turn them back on. If you hear screaming while the lights are off, run to the nearest bathroom and hide until it stops. I laughed nervously, though the sound felt hollow, empty. Screaming? In the ICU? I'd seen horror movies, of course. Everyone had. But hearing it written down like this made it somehow more real, more tangible. It wasn't just some fictional nightmare, it was a rule. It was something that had happened before. Something that could happen again. I could already feel a pit forming in my stomach. I moved to the next one. The room around me felt colder now, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something I couldn't quite place. If you see a little girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her. Do not speak. If she looks at you, return to the security room. If she speaks, talk to her until she leaves. This one made my skin crawl. A little girl, alone, in the cafeteria. The image of a small child sitting in an empty, sterile cafeteria, clutching a ragged teddy bear, was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I imagined her staring up at me with empty, hollow eyes, the kind of eyes that no child should have. It was a strange rule. Why would I have to sit with her? What could she possibly want from me? My mind raced. Was this part of some psychological test? A twisted game to see how I'd react? I could feel my heart beat faster now, my breath shallow. But I didn't let it show. I had to follow the rules. No matter how strange, no matter how terrifying. The next rule seemed almost mundane, but after the last few, it took on a sinister edge. Around 1 a.m. Check on the patients in the general ward. If one is sitting on their bed, ask if they need anything. Do not engage in conversation. If they try to talk to you, ignore them. I frowned. Don't engage in conversation? Why? The rule sounded simple, but it set my mind racing. What kind of patients were we talking about? Why shouldn't I engage? I shook my head. It didn't matter. I was here to do a job. I wasn't here to ask questions. The fifth rule was straightforward, but I still felt a chill settle over me as I read it. If it starts raining, open the front door and let people inside for shelter. They must leave by morning. If anyone stays behind, you'll see them on the security cameras. Do not look at them. I tried to make sense of it. Do not look at them? What the hell did that mean? And why would anyone stay behind? This wasn't some small, out-of-the-way building, it was a hospital, for crying out loud. People would leave, they'd have to leave, wouldn't they? But the warning not to look at them made me uneasy. Like there was something more dangerous about these mysterious figures who would come in from the rain. And then, the final rule. The one that made my blood run cold. If the security cameras go out, hide. Do not leave your hiding spot until morning. Pray that they don't find you. Hide? The cameras might go out? The implications hit me like a ton of bricks. If the cameras went down, something was going to happen. Something dangerous. Something I wasn't supposed to see. The need to hide, to be out of sight, was a terrifying thought. Why? What was I supposed to be hiding from? I glanced up at the guard, who was still standing by the door, watching me intently. I had the feeling that he wasn't just waiting for me to finish reading. He was waiting to see how I reacted. I finished reading the paper and folded it back in half. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't let it show. He leaned in a little, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "You'll need to follow them. Or else," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You won't last the night?" I wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was all some kind of sick joke. But the way he said it, like he knew exactly what would happen if I didn't follow those rules, stopped me in my tracks. I nodded slowly. I didn't trust myself to speak. There was something in his eyes that told me this wasn't a game. This wasn't a test to see how well I could follow orders. This was a matter of life and death. As the guard turned and walked out of the room, I was left alone in the security room. The rules, those bizarre, twisted instructions, flashed in my mind. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow. But I had a job to do. And no matter how insane these rules seemed, I knew one thing for sure: if I didn't follow them, I wouldn't survive the night. The hospital felt as cold and empty as the grave, a hollow shell of its intended purpose. The silence inside was palpable, thick enough to suffocate you if you let your guard down for even a second. For the first few hours, nothing happened. My job was simple enough: patrol the empty hallways, check the rooms, ensure the building was secure. But even the simplicity of the task didn't bring comfort. Something was off about this place. Something I couldn't quite place, but I felt it in my bones. The halls seemed to stretch on forever, their narrow paths lined with old, faded wallpaper that peeled away at the corners. The lighting was dim, flickering like it was struggling to stay on, casting long shadows that seemed to follow me with every step. Each footfall echoed in the empty space, amplifying the unsettling sense of isolation. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching me. It was as if the hospital itself had a pulse, a life of its own, and it was aware of my every move. I tried to ignore the growing unease, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Just follow the rules, Jake," I told myself, trying to steady my nerves. But it was hard to ignore the whispers that crept into my mind, the irrational thoughts that clawed at the edges of my sanity. There was no one around. The lights flickered again. I paused for a moment, eyes darting across the empty hallway before shaking my head and moving forward. Around 10:45 p.m., I found myself back at the security room. I didn't want to sit and stare at the monitors just yet. The stillness of the hospital was unsettling enough without staring at a series of blank screens. So I decided to do another round, check the rooms again, make sure everything was in place. I reached the first floor, walking down the dim-lit hallway that led to the front entrance. The clock on the wall read 10:55 p.m. I was supposed to wait by the door at 11 p.m., but I figured I'd get ahead of it. I stood there facing the entrance, watching the shadows shift outside. The hospital's exterior was ancient, heavy brickwork surrounding the doors like the gates of some forgotten fortress. There was no sound from outside, no car alarms, no distant hum of the city. The kind of silence that told you there was no life in the world beyond those walls. Just as the clock struck 11 p.m., the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A chill ran through the air, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. And then, just like clockwork, I saw her. A figure appeared on the other side of the glass door. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was as if she was part of the shadows. But then the woman stepped forward into the dim light, her pale face illuminated by the weak glow from the overhead lamps. She wore a hospital gown. Her hair was a tangled mess of matted strands, and her face was so pale it looked like it had never seen the sun. Her eyes were sunken, dark rings under them. She looked ill, like someone who had been lost in the hospital for days, weeks, maybe even longer. Her hands pressed against the glass, and she stared at me with desperate eyes. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. "I need to see my husband. He's been here for days, and I need to know he's okay. Please, I'm begging you." My heart began to pound. The soft tremor in her voice was enough to send a shiver down my spine. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I remembered the rule, the second rule. Ignore her. Pretend she isn't there. Her voice cracked again, louder this time. Please, I just need to see him. He's all I have left. Her face twisted in desperation, her hands now clawing at the glass, her fingers leaving smears on the surface. I stared at her, frozen in place, my breath shallow. My mind screamed at me to help her, to let her in. But the rule was clear: ignore her. I turned my back to the door, walking quickly toward the security desk, hoping she couldn't see me. My heart thudded in my chest. The air felt thick now, pressing down on me with each breath I took. I sat at the desk, hands shaking as I tried to focus on the security monitors in front of me. I could still hear her, though. Her voice echoed in my mind as if it were right next to me, even though I knew she was standing outside, just beyond the door. Please, she begged. Please let me in. The knocking began a few moments later. Soft at first, almost tentative. But it grew louder, more insistent. Thud. 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 Her fists banged against the glass, harder and harder, as if she were trying to break through. Her voice grew more frantic, almost shrill. You have to let me in. I need to see him. Don't you understand? I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just kept my focus on the screens, trying to drown out the sound of her frantic pounding, trying to ignore the image of her desperate face etched in my mind. Thud. 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 And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment I thought my mind had started to betray me. I stood, cautiously walking toward the door. I glanced out the window, my breath catching in my throat. She was gone. No sign of her. No trace. The cold emptiness outside seemed more desolate now, as if her presence had never been there at all. I turned back to the security monitors. The screens were filled with the same empty, lifeless hallways, the same dark corners of the hospital. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning. Something had crossed into this world that shouldn't have been there. And I had just followed the first of the rules completely, mindlessly, without realizing that ignoring her was only the beginning. The clock read 11:20 p.m. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. The night had only just begun, but already I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every shadow cast in the corner of my eye made me feel like I was being watched. And I knew deep down that it wasn't just the hospital that was watching. It was something else. Something in here with me. Something waiting for me to break the rules. Something that wouldn't hesitate to make sure I paid the price for it. But for now, all I could do was wait and follow the rules. The night was just beginning, and I had no idea how much worse it could get. The next rule was simple, or so I thought. Ensure that the lights in the ICU stay on at all times, it said. If they go out, you must go there and turn them back on. As ridiculous as it sounded, there was no denying the underlying gravity of the instruction. After all, this was a hospital. Why would anyone have to specify that the lights in the ICU must remain on? But I didn't dare question it, not after everything I'd seen so far. Whatever twisted logic this place followed, I wasn't about to break the rules. Not if I wanted to survive the night. The hospital seemed quieter as the night went on, but I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation. The hallways, once intimidating, now felt suffocating. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Every slight sound, my breathing, the creak of the floor beneath my boots, felt amplified in the thick, stale air. I glanced at the clock. 11:55 p.m. The quiet was too much. I tried to keep my focus on the monitors, but it was difficult. Every flicker of the screens, every glitch in the video feed felt like something was lurking just outside my view. Then, at midnight sharp, the lights flickered. A subtle stutter in the overhead bulbs, like a brief hesitation, a pulse that faltered in its rhythm. For a moment, I thought it was just a glitch, something minor. Hospitals were old, weren't they? Maybe the wiring was bad. I could almost convince myself that nothing was wrong. That's when the lights went out completely. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My mind raced. The rule, the lights, the ICU was at the end of the hallway, and the darkness that enveloped it felt wrong. It wasn't like the usual dim glow you expect in a hospital at night. It was an unnatural dark, like something had sucked the light right out of the room, leaving only cold shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether I should even go. What was happening in that room? Why would the lights go out? And why did it feel like the entire building was holding its breath? I shook my head. No, I have to do this. I have to follow the rules. I moved toward the ICU, my footsteps strangely muffled like I was walking through thick, wet sand. The hallway stretched before me, its length extending into a void, the darkness inching closer with every step I took. My hand brushed the wall for guidance, and the coldness of the stone made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. A scream. Not just any scream. This wasn't a distant wail or the sound of a patient in pain. It was primal, the kind of scream that claws at your insides and sends a bolt of ice straight through your veins. It was raw, full of terror, a sound so pure and unrelenting it made my blood run cold. I stopped in my tracks. The scream echoed down the hall, vibrating off the walls. My heart pounded against my ribs, my palms slick with sweat. I told myself it was just a patient. That's all it was. Just a patient. But the sound didn't let me believe it. There was something too real about it. Too alive. I swallowed hard and forced my feet to move. The ICU door was just ahead. The darkness ahead was complete. Nothing but shadows beyond the threshold. I reached for the handle, and the cold metal sent a jolt of unease through my arm. With a sharp breath, I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The darkness inside the ICU was absolute. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a warning, a reminder that I was doing something I had no business doing. I could see nothing, the kind of blackness that swallows light whole. But there was no time to hesitate. I had to follow the rule. I fumbled along the wall to find the light switch, my fingers brushing against the cool, slick surface. The terror clawed at my throat, but I pressed on, my mind fixated on the single task at hand. Get the lights on. I found the switch. With trembling fingers, I flipped it. For a split second, nothing happened. My stomach twisted in knots, and I thought maybe the lights had gone out permanently. And then, click! The fluorescent lights buzzed to life, flickering once before settling into their cold, sterile glow. The room was empty. No patients, no nurses, no sign of life, but the air felt thick, heavy. I couldn't shake the sensation that something had just been there. Something unseen, something that had moved in and out of the shadows while I was too distracted to notice. Before I could even take a full breath, another scream echoed through the hallway, louder this time, more desperate. My blood ran cold. I turned, my heart lurching in my chest. It wasn't coming from the ICU. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the hospital. The hallway stretched long in front of me, and I could feel something moving within the shadows. The next rule flashed through my mind. If you hear screaming, run to the nearest bathroom and hide until it stops. I didn't hesitate. The sound of the scream was enough. I didn't even stop to think. My instincts kicked in, and I sprinted down the hall, my boots thudding against the tile as I dashed for the nearest restroom. I burst into the bathroom and slammed the door behind me, locking it with frantic hands. I pressed my back against the cold wall and tried to steady my breath. My heart was racing. What was that scream? What was in this building? Outside the door, the hallway was silent once again. The only sound was my ragged breathing, the pulse in my ears. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, just silence. It was almost worse than the scream. The minutes stretched out like hours. I waited. I listened. I heard nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my chest. What felt like an eternity later, I finally ventured out of the bathroom. The hallway was empty, silent. The lights hummed above me, their glow sharp and unnatural. But I knew one thing for sure now. The hospital wasn't empty. Not anymore. There were things here, things that moved in the dark. Things that followed the rules just like I had. And I had no idea what I was dealing with. I looked back at the ICU door. The lights were on now, the sterile white glow washing over the space. But I didn't want to go back in there. I didn't want to see what lay beyond that threshold, what else was hidden in the shadows. But the rules were clear. I had to follow them. And so I did. But deep down, I could feel it. This was only the beginning. By the time the clock hit 1 a.m., everything in the hospital felt like it was descending into madness. The air had grown thick, oppressive, like something invisible was pressing down on me. I was no longer sure of what was real or what I had imagined. The rules I had been following, strange, cryptic, terrifying, seemed more like a twisted game with no clear end in sight. Each one more bizarre than the last, each more difficult to ignore. I had just finished checking on the ICU, making sure the lights were still on, when I decided to take a walk through the cafeteria. I needed something to ground me, to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sickly shadows along the rows of empty tables. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that echoes in your ears long after it's gone. I was so focused on the eerie stillness of the space that I didn't notice her at first. She was sitting at one of the tables, alone. A little girl. I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. She was small, frail, her face pale and unblinking as she sat there in the middle of the cafeteria, her hands resting on a worn-out teddy bear. The bear's fur was matted and dirty, its button eyes barely hanging on by a thin thread. She stared at me, her eyes wide, unblinking. Not a single movement or sound except the soft shuffle of her fingers as they twisted the bear's arm slowly, almost methodically. I froze in place, my heart skipping a beat. There was something wrong about her. Something about the stillness, the silence, the way she looked at me with that unnerving, hollow stare. It was like she was studying me, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat, and for a brief moment, I wanted to turn around, walk away, pretend I never saw her. But then the rule came back to me, the one that had haunted me ever since I first read it. If you see a little girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her. Do not speak. If she looks at you, return to the security room. If she speaks, talk to her until she leaves. I had no choice. My legs moved on their own, each step toward her feeling heavier than the last. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I reached the table. The girl didn't move, didn't even blink. Her eyes followed me, but her face was expressionless, devoid of emotion. I sat down next to her, unsure of what was happening, unsure of how this would play out. The rules were clear. I had to follow them. Do you want to play hide and seek? She asked suddenly, her voice light and unnervingly cheerful, like she was asking me to join her in a game of tag on a sunny afternoon. The sweetness in her voice sent a chill crawling down my spine. It was too bright, too innocent, completely out of place in this empty, sterile hospital at this ungodly hour. I wanted to say no. I wanted to run, to escape the horror of it all, but something kept me rooted to the chair. Maybe it was the rules. Maybe it was the deep, gnawing fear that if I didn't follow them, something worse would happen. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky as I asked, "How do we play?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at me, her teddy bear cradled against her chest as if it were a living thing. Her eyes shone with an odd excitement, the kind you only see in a child who has no idea of the danger they might be in. It was as though she had no fear, as if whatever this was just another game for her. "I'll count to 60, she said finally, her voice sweet but hollow. "Then I'll come find you." The words lingered in the air for a moment, hanging between us, thick and heavy. Her smile was too wide, too knowing, as if she was inviting me into a world I wasn't prepared to enter. My skin crawled, but I couldn't leave. The rule was clear: sit next to her. No words. Nothing. I had no choice but to stay. Her little voice broke the silence again. A sing-song lilt to it as she began counting. 1, 2, 3. Her voice echoed off the walls of the cafeteria. I tried not to look at her too much. I could feel her gaze on me, the weight of it pressing down on me. Her eyes never left mine as she counted. Her lips barely moved, but I could hear each word clearly, like it was being whispered into my ear. 59, 60, she finished, clapping her hands together as if the game had just begun. She stood up slowly, her movements fluid but unervingly slow, like she was savoring every second of the moment. I didn't dare move. My body refused to listen to me. I wanted to bolt, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. I glanced around, desperate for an escape, but the door to the hallway seemed miles away. The cafeteria had never felt so big, so suffocating. The light above me flickered again, a single buzz cutting through the silence, before it settled back into a dull hum. Then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible sound, the creak of the floorboards behind me. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty space, the shadowy corners of the cafeteria, and the girl. She was standing still, her back to me now, her head tilted slightly as she peered around the room, her teddy bear still held firmly in her arms. Her body was poised, tense. It was like she was waiting for something, or someone. She was no longer just a child. In that moment, she felt like a predator, like the game had shifted and now I was the prey. I couldn't explain why, but an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. She wasn't just a little girl, she was something far darker, far more sinister. "Ready or not," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My breath hitched. That was the moment I knew I had to get away. I had to follow the rules, I reminded myself. But how long could I keep doing this? How much longer could I endure whatever nightmare was unfolding around me? I stood up abruptly, my legs shaky. I need to go," I said, my voice weak. My stomach churned as I realized I couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't play her game. But when I turned to leave, the door wouldn't open. The handle twisted in my hand, but the door was stuck. It wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed. And behind me, the girl was silent, too silent. I turned back to face her. She was standing still, her eyes now locked on me with a strange intensity. I could feel her gaze searing through me and I couldn't look away. My heart pounded as she stepped closer, inch by inch. "You didn't want to play," she said softly, almost sadly, but her tone carried a sharp edge, as if there was a hidden threat beneath her words. The air in the cafeteria felt cold now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. I backed away, panic rising in my chest as I struggled with the door. My fingers were slick with sweat, my breath ragged and shallow. I had to get out of here. I had to escape before whatever this was swallowed me whole. And as I turned away from the girl, I heard one last thing before the door finally opened with a sickening creak. "Next time, you'll play, or else." I didn't look back. I couldn't. And I wouldn't stop running until I knew I was far, far away from her. From this place. From whatever had awakened inside the hospital that night. By the time the clock struck 3 a.m., I could feel the walls closing in on me. The rules, which had once seemed like strange formalities, now felt like the lifeblood of my survival. Each step I took, each action I followed, was a desperate attempt to make it through the night. But the tension in the air had thickened to the point where every sound, every flicker of light, seemed to be part of something far darker. The whispers about the surgeon, the ones I had initially written off as strange rumors, now began to make sense in the most horrifying way. The hospital was alive with danger, and the worst part was that it wasn't just the darkness I had to fear. It was him. I had walked past the general ward earlier, where the patients were bedridden, their eyes hollow and vacant, their bodies thin and frail. I remembered the strange warnings they had given me. One patient had reached out with a trembling hand, gripping my arm just long enough to whisper, "Be careful of the surgeon. He's still here, still hunting." I had dismissed it, chalking it up to delirium or fear. But as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of something following me. The air in the hallways was suffocating, each step more cumbersome than the last, and the shadows seemed to gather in corners, watching me. I continued my rounds, following the rules like a lifeline. But with every corner I turned, every creak of the floor beneath my feet, I felt the presence of someone, nearby. It wasn't just the strange figures walking the hallways or the disembodied screams echoing from the depths of the hospital. It was something far more tangible. Then it happened. I was walking down a dimly lit hallway, nearing the end where the emergency staircase led down to the basement. I had passed this spot several times, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with an unexplainable weight, and my heart rate quickened as I glanced toward the stairwell. That's when I saw him. The surgeon. He stepped out from the shadows, his figure tall and imposing. His face was covered by a surgical mask, but his eyes, they were what terrified me. Dark, cold, calculating. He locked eyes with me, and in that moment, it felt like he could see right through me. His presence was suffocating, the kind of presence that made every instinct in your body scream to run. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in his gaze, unable to break free. He stood still, unmoving, his cold stare fixed on me. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The words sent a chill down my spine. The way he said it, it was less like a statement and more like a warning, like he was reminding me of something I wasn't supposed to forget. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I was at the center of it. Before I could react, he vanished into the shadows, his footsteps muffled in the darkness. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't stay here. I had to follow the rules. I had to get back to the security room. But the image of his eyes haunted me. I could still feel his gaze, cold and calculating, boring into me from the depths of the hospital. It was nearing 5 a.m., and every minute felt like an eternity. The hospital, once familiar and quiet, had become a labyrinth of terror. The once empty hallways now felt like claustrophobic traps, every corner hiding something unseen, every shadow a potential threat. The rules, which had started as strange, arbitrary instructions, had become my only guide to survival. The minutes dragged on, the ticking of the clock like a countdown. I couldn't keep track of how many times I checked the security cameras, how many times I glanced at the entrance, hoping to see someone, anyone, coming to relieve me. But the hallways remained empty. The lights flickered with every passing second, and in the silence I could hear things moving in the dark. Footsteps, whispers, screams. I had one chance, one last chance to get out of this nightmare. The rules were clear. I had to stay in the security room until morning, but something told me that staying put would be my death sentence. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to leave the building, to escape this madness. But where could I go? How could I escape something that seemed to be alive, something that moved in the darkness, something that had been hunting me since the moment I stepped foot in this place? The clock ticked down to 5:45 a.m. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I stared at the monitors, willing myself to stay calm. The sun would rise soon, but would it be enough? Would I survive until then? I knew that if I didn't leave now, I might never get another chance. At 5:50 a.m., the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the blinds. The building, which had once seemed like a maze of shadows, was now bathed in a soft, pale light. The sense of dread hadn't completely left, but it was more manageable now. The daylight had a way of making the horror feel distant, like it was somehow contained within the walls, locked away until nightfall. I bolted from the security room, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted down the hallways. The hospital, which just hours ago had felt like a claustrophobic nightmare, now felt like a maze I had to escape. Every footstep echoed in the stillness, but there was no turning back. I had to get out. I rushed to the front doors, my fingers fumbling with the locks. When they finally gave way, the first breath of fresh air hit me like a flood. I stepped outside, my legs weak beneath me, my heart still racing. I stumbled to my car, my mind still reeling from the horrors I had witnessed, from the things I had seen lurking in the shadows. I had made it. But even as I drove away, the fear never fully left me. I could still feel the surgeon's eyes on me, still hear the whispers in the dark. I didn't know what had happened in that place. I didn't know what it was or what I had become part of. But one thing was certain, I would never, ever return to that hospital. Not for any amount of money, not for any job, not for anything. Some doors, once open, should never be closed again. It's finally over, or so he thinks. He runs. But the terror, the nightmare that followed him for hours won't be so easily shaken. And as he steps into the light of morning, he wonders, was it all just a twisted test, or is something far darker still waiting in the shadows? He escaped the hospital, but did he really escape the horror? Some places aren't just haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by what's still alive.